Good evening. I'm Sarah Graham. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Communications and Advocacy Manager here at the YWCA National Capital Area. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this courageous conversation, anti-voting legislation, the new Jim Crow. Through new legislation or lack of full representation to begin with, voting rights in our country continue to be eroded in communities. And we are going to talk about that today. This evening, we have two panelists. We are joined by Jamal Holtz and April England-Albright. I'll let them introduce themselves here in a minute to have a conversation about what you can do to support efforts for unrestricted access to the ballot box. If you haven't been here before, these conversations run about an hour with 30 to 45 minutes of panel and 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Feel free to add any questions you may have in the chat along the way. I want to go over a few housekeeping reminders, run of show things for folks that are new. Please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know what you hope to learn about today. Also, a reminder, love conversations around here, so be sure to interact in the chat during this, during our speakers. All the lines are muted at the moment, and we ask that you remain muted until the end during our Q&A. We are also a 501c3 organization, and this conversation and the resources shared here will all and should be nonpartisan. I'd like to pass the mic to our CEO, Monica Gray, for a quick intro, and then we can begin our discussion. Monica.
Thanks, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Sarah said, our Courageous Conversation sessions are part of an effort that we launched about 4 years ago to engage the community in important conversations that we needed to have. And this was in advance of a lot of the racial justice conversations that were launched after a lot of the activities last year. And so about 4 years ago, we decided that there were some really critical conversations that the community needed to have, particularly as we saw escalating race-based violence across the nation as much as 4 and 5 years ago. And we thought it was important in our community to start having these conversations. And so we would host community roundtable dinners with the facilitator to discuss a wide variety of conversations about race and racial justice and racial equity. And as we all know, the world changed just under 2 years ago. And so we moved these conversations into a virtual setting. Our goal is to return to in-person conversations because we found gathering people around a table for dinner provided us with conversations that were rich and engaging and really enlightening for a lot of folks. And so we hope that at some point in 2022, we will be able to gather again in person. But the work needs to continue to be done despite the restrictions that confront all of us. We should also note that this is the beginning of a series of conversations and activations that we will be having around voting rights, particularly as we move through the next several years. As we all know, 2022 will be a lot more impactful because there are a lot more elected offices up for renewal or replacement. And then as we move toward the next presidential election. And so one of the things we want to make sure that we do is, despite all the efforts to suppress voting rights for people across the country, and despite the failure to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, there's still a lot of work to be done at the local, state, and national level to protect and increase and improve voting rights for all Americans. And so we thank you for joining us in this first conversation. And we have some phenomenal speakers who are joining us this evening. We hope that they will continue the conversation with us into the coming several years. So thanks so much. And Sarah.
Thank you so much for that, Monica. I am looking forward to 2022 and really having the RY focus on voting rights and getting out the vote. But let's get started. Let's dig right in. Despite the Voting Rights Act of 1965, voter suppression continues primarily in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And I'm just wondering, how did we get here? And what can we do about it? April, you want to start?
Hi, everybody. I'm April Albright, and I am the legal director for Black Voters Matter Fund. I'm really excited to be here. I think conversations really are the way that we navigate and figure out how we can create policies that allow for all people who live on this land to share in power, right, and resources, and to determine what happens with those resources. And so I'm always glad to be in conversations about that. My organization is a part of, one of the things that we do is we look for, like-minded organizations and people who are doing really good work in communities all over, this country. And we try to find ways to resource them in order that they can do more in their communities, more good work. Specifically, not only around voting, but certainly voting is a part of that. And so the topic of voting is very, very important to us because we know that it is one of the tools in this country to not only express what your values are, but then to also play a part in electing people or putting forth ballot initiatives that will help further express your concerns and values for your community and your family. And so how we got here is a century-old problem. We know for a fact that, America constitutionally, initially, when they said we the people, it only included white male Protestant men who were landowners. So not all white men were able to vote. It was those white men who had land. And so periodically throughout history, we know the struggles that have had to happen in order to make the we the people become more inclusive, including the descendants of those individuals who were originally enslaved, including the indigenous community, right? Including women and young people and others. And so what we find ourselves now doing is the same thing that our ancestors had to do, is to bring might and power to the words that are in the Constitution. And it's an unfortunate thing, but it is a historical thing. It's unfortunate that we have to be here in this moment, many years after the Voting Rights Act, but even more years, right, past the 15th Amendment, right, or the 19th Amendment and other amendments. But we are nevertheless here because America has to continue to be prodded to become more inclusive. And it's now our part and our responsibility to continue that struggle to bring more, into the struggle. So I'll stop now so Jamal can join me in this conversation.
I'm fine with sitting back and just listening to you, April. My name is Jamal Holtz. I'm a lead organizer of 51 for 51. It's a statehood campaign to make DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. And it's truly an honor to be in the room right now with all women, because women have always been at the forefront of any movement, and is the reason why strong men are the reason they are. It's because of you all, it's because of women. You carried the back of our country on your shoulders for years, and people underappreciate that. So grateful to be in this space right now. But what I fight for is voter is what I like to call voter suppression in chief. It's where you have more than 700,000 mostly Black and brown people currently living in the shadows of democracy, in the shadows of the United States Capitol, who have never had a vote in Congress nor equal protection under the law. Because DC is not a state. And the lack of statehood was born out of the moral stain of slavery and persists throughout desperate political games we're seeing right now to suppress Black and brown political power and progress. And the only thing standing between us, DC residents and Black and brown people in Washington, DC, and more than 700,000 people in their rights and privileges of statehood is this arcane Senate loophole known as the filibuster. It's a Jim Crow relic, which was a favorite weapon used by segregationists during civil rights time to block true progress for our country, to block anti-lynching bills, to try to block the 1964 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and all those things that have allowed our country to give more and more power to Black and brown people in our country. So that's what I'm fighting for to give Black and brown people finally a vote in their democracy, but also not allow what has stopped us from reaching true progress to stop us from reaching that reform. So that's why we say 51 for 51. And I'll just say for the past 2 years, when we started this campaign in May of 2019, we said that if 51 votes was enough for Mitch McConnell to confirm 3 Supreme Court justices, then it should be enough for democracy. It should be enough to pass Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and the Freedom of Vote Act, and DC statehood. So why isn't it enough for that? And it's primarily, again, back to the moral standard that was born out of. And as we're talking about over 400 voter suppression laws that are happening across the country, we also have to ensure that we're talking about voter suppression happening right here in the District of Columbia, in our nation's capital. And that's what I spent the past 2 years traveling across the country talking about. When we started this campaign, it was getting presidential candidates to endorse our mission. Young Black kids from Washington, D.C. walking up to people like President Biden and Secretary Buttigieg with cameras in their faces and saying, hey, do you support statehood, and do you support it with ending the filibuster to get it done? And luckily, we were able to lock in 21 presidential candidates during that time. And I'll just end it with this. President Biden made it his commitment to us that he supports 51 for 51, but he made it his commitment to America that racial justice was going to be at the forefront of his administration and what he was going to focus on the first year. We're almost a year in and we have yet to see any progress made on voting rights. And it's President Biden's job to move the Congress forward, but it's the people who we elect across the country to move us forward in our democracy. And President Biden and Vice President Harris has to show us that they're truly committed to advancing our democracy and living up to the ideals of our democracy.
Wow. This is why I had both of you join us. I think you are doing amazing things in a variety of different ways, both on the ground, but also I think the education portion of your work is fantastic. I think I want to talk, I mean, Jamal, I think you shared a lot about what's going on with DC statehood and voter suppression, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some maybe the not so obvious ways that DC statehood impacts the right to vote for the 700,000 plus citizens here in the district.
Yeah, I mean, it's every day we're losing out on the opportunity just to have a voice on the most important issues for our democracy. I mean, right now we're fighting for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom of Vote Act, and DC residents don't even have a vote in the halls of Congress to support those acts. And if we had 2 votes, we wouldn't be talking about it anymore. It would be passed and done. And that's what we're seeing across the country. When American citizens are fighting for at least 1 or 2 votes to make true reform for our country, it's always stalled by 1 or 2 people. I think about the reasons why I joined this fight, because it's personal for me. In 2014, as a young 16-year-old, and I just dated myself and gave you my age. As a 2014, when I was advocating for city issues in my community, and I saw a lot of things happen in my community, I often wanted to advocate at a higher level, especially during 2014 when the Affordable Care Act was in discussion. It was giving American families, every American family, the basic opportunity to walk into a hospital and get treatment and get basic health insurance. And for me, my mom was uninsured. So as a young advocate, that was something I wanted to advocate for. And DC has this thing called shadow senators. And when I realized that my shadow senators didn't have a vote on these pressing bills, I realized I lived in the shadows of democracy, that I couldn't get a vote on the things that impacted me and my family or thousands of residents in Washington, DC. And then my advocacy ended at the mayor's office. So when you talk about healthcare, women's reproductive rights, at a time where DC was told no, that they couldn't spend local dollars on women's reproductive health, was told no, you couldn't pass local laws to prevent people, to prevent certain gun violence measures. We were told no many times and rejected by a Republican-led Congress. And this January, when we saw white supremacists, this past January, when we saw white supremacists descend not just on the US Capitol, but in the neighborhoods that we call home, our community was left vulnerable to the violence of hate and then called to clean up the mess because we lack protection of statehood. We weren't able to call in the National Guard because the mayor, unlike any other governor across the country, didn't have the authority to call in the National Guard to authorize and support. But also the people that cleaned up the streets, that spewed white hate signs everywhere, was DC residents. So we came in to save democracy, but democracy can't save us. And that's what I'm fighting for. And truly, that's what we're seeing every day in the District of Columbia.
Thank you. April, I want to pass it over to you. I think the last time I checked, 18 states, it's probably more, have passed laws that restrict voting, and that's just at the state level. I know at the local county level, it's significantly higher. What do you think like the best way to stop those kind of legislative actions is?
Well, one of the things we've been fighting for, for the most part of this year has been for, the federal government to act. It is vital because in most of these states, which are extremely gerrymandered, and we have to talk about that because when we talk about the census and we talk about the process to redistrict and redraw lines, we understand that in many of these states, they are so gerrymandered. And what I mean when I say that is, the electoral voting lines are drawn in a way where your representation is all but enshrined to happen for a period of 10 years, no matter the changing demographics of that state. And so as a result of that, very conservative people who desire to oppress the minority population in those marginalized communities control the power of legislation in those states. And so in order to counter that, because the voters themselves, right, who desire something more, who demonstrate their desire to want something different and more at the voting polls, it will not translate into actual policy and legislation. And so the federal government has to act. It has always historically had to act to not only create voting legislation, right? Because we talked about the voting rights legislation of 1965, but it also has to enforce it. And so what we need right now is new federal legislation that will stop these bills from being enacted, right? So the first leg is making sure that your local congresspeople, right, and your local senators understand the urgency of this moment, especially in light of the fact that right now, they're meeting in state halls to draw lines that will be in place for the next 10 years. And so we know right now there's actual federal legislation that had been pending all year, one of which was designed to bring some uniformity, right, to how we, deal with voting. The Constitution allows for states to have the power of what they call time, place, and manner, right? And what that basically means is that states have the power to determine how to administrate elections. And what we've seen historically is that states have used that power as a weapon. And so what we hope is that federal legislation will, one thing, nationalize the process of how you vote in all states. It makes no sense that in some states, right, you get early voting, while in others you can't. It makes no sense that in some states, there's no excuse mail-in voting, while in others, you can only do it if you have certain excuses. It makes no sense in some states that you can use certain kinds of IDs, while in other states, a student ID won't work. But in another state, your gun permit ID will work. So, so we are asking for federal legislation to unify that. We're also asking them to unify, how registration occurs. It should be automatic, right? And that doesn't benefit just one community, it benefits everyone. And so we're asking that they create a process in this legislation, which now is called the Freedom to Vote Act, that will allow for a national registration process. But more importantly, and I want to end with this, is that something far more sinister is happening. After January the 6th, when there was the big lie, right? where there was a lie that there was so much voter fraud, even though if you go into the chambers where these voter suppression bills happen, some of which I was able to go to, they clearly noted that there was no evidence of fraud. You would actually hear the representatives locally who were creating these bills, when asked and pressed, is there voter suppression that would warrant these type of sweeping changes and restrictions? And they readily said no, because they had to, because their Secretary of States, even those conservative ones, were very clear that those things didn't occur, but it didn't stop these bills from passing. And one of the most important and sinister provisions is that now in these states, they're making it easier to undo election results. That is happening right now. They are able to remove, electoral, employees or poll workers or board of electors. They're able to change and challenge results a lot more easily. And so what we know and what this new federal legislation will do is stop that from happening. We also know what's also sinister is they're going to allow for many partisan poll watchers to have free will within inside the voting place. When you go in and people would give you space, in many states like Texas and Florida and Georgia, they've changed that provision so that now partisan poll workers can freely move about. There's no limitation even how close they can come or interact with voters. And so this federal legislation would make it clear that you can't do that, right? And finally, as it relates to gerrymandering, this new law would require that independent commissions begin to create the lines for states, right? This country was not a pure democracy. It was a republic, and many of us know that. And what that means is that your representation, your voted representation, should be able to make decisions and policies that reflect your will. Gerrymandering precludes that from happening. And so this new legislation would require that independent commissions who don't have that partisan influence will begin the process of using the census data correctly. Not like they're doing in Texas right now, right? Where the highest population of growth in Texas is the Latinx community. Yet they have literally removed all of their districts in the proposed maps. And so what these independent commissioners will do is begin the process of drawing lines that adequately reflect what the census data shows, which is that there's a huge growth in many of the marginalized communities in this country. And so right now, what you can do is join us in our fight to push this Democratic led House and Senate to pass this bill. Because it is not a partisan bill. It doesn't just benefit people who vote Republican or people who vote Democrat, right? It doesn't even just benefit one community. But through this legislation, it will enshrine the right in the Constitution that we all have to vote. And so we think right now, one of the most important things we can do is find our way to lift this bill up and encourage our legislators to do the right thing and pass it.
Yeah. And I'll just, that was so spot on. And I'll just say one thing. John Lewis has always said that your vote is one of the most precious and most sacred things that you can have as an individual. And there are Republican officials trying to stop some people from voting, and we know who those some people are. And as April alluded to, our democracy, quote unquote, the urgency of this moment is truly now, not because there are so many people taking the streets, not because we're angry about it, and not because of how much we want to change what's happening before 2022. But the urgency of this moment is now, because I believe that the next 4 years, the decisions we make in the next 4 years will determine our democracy and what it will look like over the next 40 years. And I say that because there's no other democracy, unless we're talking about the Roman Empire, that has lasted longer than 200 years. America has been founded for 230 years. So we're truly at a crossroads if we're going to be a true democracy and live up to it, or if we're going to move more into an authoritarian republic system where the people have no say or no right to vote or no opportunity in their government. And as we're embarking upon that timeline, if we don't get this right now, we're truly going to lose what our democracy looks like over the next 40 years.
Thank you guys. Thank you both so much. I know we talked a little bit about, I mean, April, you talked a lot about what like legislative national voter legislation is out there in the universe right now. I think if you could do like a quick primer, like these are the 4 things that people should pay attention to, whether that's on Twitter or social media or in the news, just so they can kind of keep up with what's going on.
Yeah, right now, the Freedom to Vote Act is what is being floated in the Senate right now. There were earlier iterations of this legislation that did not pass. Majority Leader Schumer just last week did present this bill, for discussion on the floor in the Senate, but they did not vote to allow for discussion on this bill. There's also the John Lewis Advancement Act, and that's important to know about because we've been talking about the uniformity of making sure that the voting process, that time, place, and manner becomes more unified so it can be protected. So no matter what state you live in, you can be protected. But there was a time in the Voting Rights Act that there was pre-clearance, which meant that a lot of this legislation that is being passed in the halls of night in a lot of these states would not have never seen the light of day because they would have first had to go to the Department of Justice in order for the Department of Justice to make sure that those bills were not related to any vestiges of prior discriminatory practices. And so the Shelby versus Holder decision, which came out in 2013, undid that, right? And so as a result, there is no more pre-clearance or no more oversight from the Department of Justice. You have to literally bring litigation, which is very expensive, in order to challenge these bills after the fact. And sometimes the court system doesn't move aggressively or make the right decisions. And so the John Lewis Advancement Act seeks to put back in place that enforcement and oversight power to the Department of Justice. And that is important. And that's something that we need to be looking out for and listening for passage so that we could get that very important oversight back to stop any future, right, attempts to subvert people's voting rights. So that's something else that needs to be looked out for. Of course, all things are local, right? And so while we have our eyesight on what's happening federally, because we know we need those things to offset what may be happening in the state level, it is very important that we always have our eyes open at all levels. We see what is happening nationally at Board of Education meetings. We see what's happening at county commission meetings. We now see what's happening even at simple Board of Electors meetings, things that people normally didn't think about. But yet there is this sinister move to look at all levers of power in this country and pull those levers in a way to prevent a more inclusive democracy from forming and amorphosing out of the ashes. And so as a result of that, we now have to be involved at every single level. We have to go to these meetings to make sure that there are not these hybrid, right, same type of legislations that are happening even in ordinances in your city. And so while I can't name the specific title to these bills, what I will say is these voter suppression bills and how local boards are doing elections happen at your Board of Election meetings in your county. They determine when your polls are open, how many polls are open, how they're staffed, how the resources in that county is going to utilize to make sure that precincts are open or closed. Why is that relevant? Because if in certain communities, you start closing polling locations, right? But in other communities, you start opening more or making sure that the status quo is maintained, then those marginalized communities, right, will have situations where people are in line sometimes 6, 7, 8 hours. And we also know that many of these state bills now make it illegal and unlawful to provide voter comfort. In the state of Georgia, you can't even provide water and food or battery support or hand warmers, right, to people who may be subjected to long lines at their polling place because their polling locations were closed, right, due to those very local decisions around where do resources go when we deal with the polling, the voting infrastructure? And so it is important that we look at those things right now and attend those meetings at our county commissioners and our board of electors to be mindful about what kind of policies are they producing for voting in my community.
Jamal, I'd love a quick update on where DC statehood is right now. We have a lot of DC folk or
Yeah.
D&D folk here.
No, for sure. I mean, right now, the bill has passed in the past year. The bill has passed the House twice, record number co-sponsors on that bill. Right now, we're in the Senate. The bill sits in the Senate Homeland Security and Government Accountability Committee. And it has had debate, and now we're pushing for it to go forward to markup. So the way it works is you debate, you mark the bill up, and then you push it forward for a vote out of committee, and then it opens up on the floor. And we're right now urging people like Senator Peters to push that bill forward as a chairperson. But the bill sits in the Senate with 46 co-sponsors. That's a record number of co-sponsors the DC statehood bill has ever. I mean, it's a record that DC statehood even had a debate on the Senate floor this past year. But Congress has a rare opportunity now with the democratically controlled Congress and White House to really grant DC statehood this session and must find the courage to pass it through the Senate with 51 votes. So I believe that we could, with 46 co-sponsors, we can get 4 more and ensure that we're passing with 51 votes.
Wonderful. I think this is a good segue into talking a little about, you aged yourself earlier. So, you know, young folk, as we all know, are often the leaders and for movements for justice and equity. And I'm wondering how this group can help support young voices and also make sure that they're in the room where the things happen. So love to hear your input.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all young at heart, but you all have truly paved the way for people like me to be a part of these movements. And it's great. It's grateful and gracious to be able to learn from leaders who have been in this movement for decades and years. But it's also still very unfortunate that me at 23 years old is still fighting for something we fought for over 200 years. It is very unfortunate that me at 23 years old is still fighting for the same thing that John Lewis and Martin Luther King fought for 58 years ago. And that's the unfortunate truth. On Tuesday, this upcoming Wednesday, actually next week, young people are risking arrest at the White House to call on President Biden. And when I say young people, I mean like myself at 23 years old, but also people like Yolanda King, who is 13 years old and the granddaughter of Martin Luther King, to risk arrest at 13 years old and say that I want voting rights when I get the opportunity to vote, and that DC residents shouldn't be held out from their voter representation as well. That's it's a powerful thing to hear, but it's also a sad, unfortunate truth. Right. So I think one of the things that we have to do is show that this is not just, all right, time to pass the baton, but show that this is an intergenerational movement to really help us move us to true progress. And even if the issue doesn't impact you, it does. The fact, and I talk about DC, the day DC becomes a state, it's a changing day for America. The things that we've been advocating for, like a more affordable healthcare, more affordable housing, all the things that we are advocating for in our communities, we now have a voice and a vote on that in our democracy. So these things impact all of us. And if we aren't thinking of ways that we can help one another, then we're losing out every day. So always find ways that you can get engaged. Later in the chat, I'll drop our website and toolkits and ways that you can get engaged, whether it's calling a senator or email. If you live in Washington, D.C. like me and don't have a senator, emailing people like Chuck Schumer to tell him make it his priority to pass voting rights bills all across the board.
April, I'd love to hear how Black Voters Matter is engaging young folk.
Well, it was interesting. One of the programs that we have right now, that we have campaigns that we started is called Take the Field. We're specifically targeting young people on college campuses because, as you highlighted before, young people are using the igniters and faces and oftentimes the courageous soldiers of our movements. And so, through this Take to Field campaign, we are trying to reignite that. I was very blessed as a young attorney to meet John Lewis, to meet C.T. Vivian and others, who at that time, Reverend James Orange, Reverend, Bevel, who at that time were very young people, right? They were college students who had the courage and bravery. This past summer, we actually commemorated we commemorated the Freedom Rise, where we honored those young students during that anniversary to just, we went to 10 states, and on our bus, we had, the images of those young people who were who went into danger, right? I often tell the story of Diane Nash, who was one of the organizers of the Freedom Rides, who essentially was told the night before not to travel to Nashville because if she did, they were going to be waiting for them. And she told him, her reaction was, we going. We all understood that. We've talked to our families, we've told everyone, and they rode into danger. And so with that in mind, we understand the importance of igniting that courage in our young people. And so we started our Take the Field campaign. Also, a lot of our staff are young people. We make sure probably 70% of our staff, are 25 and younger, 30 years old and younger, because we believe that we've got to continue. First of all, we've got to make sure that our young people understand that they have to play a role, right, in building the kind of democracy we want to see, but also that they also have visions for what they want, right, because they're inheriting this country. And so it is very important that their voices are heard, and not just heard, are a part of the decision making and the strategizing on how we get this inclusive democracy that we're talking about. So those are just some of the couple of ways that we are right now, real time, trying to ignite and support young folks. We are supporting a couple of students who, for example, Howard University right now is organizing for their student rights. And so we have provided resources to those students. We intend to be with them if they're still out there next week, in person, fighting for those rights. We're doing the same thing down here at the AOC in Atlanta, because we believe that their voices need to be heard.
Well, stop by and say hey when you're in DC next week. I like to end these conversations before we open it up in Q&A with giving you both a chance to provide any calls to actions you have for this group. So like, what can people do today? What can they do tomorrow? And then kind of what bigger picture asks you have personally. So whoever would like to go.
I'm happy to jump in and close it out with saying this, that of course I'm gonna talk about statehood, but I'll just say that the disputes about statehood have always been about race. Segregationists didn't want to admit Hawaii and New Mexico into the Union because they said that their populations were majority people of color and too indigenous. And just like now, you got senators like Tom Cotton and other Republicans are using dog whistle tactics to block DC statehood, saying that DC doesn't have real people, or because we don't have enough loggers and factory workers or car dealerships. It's all coded language that is just blatantly racist, and we won't stand for it. And right now, this is our moment is our moment to really reform what our democracy looks like. And it's our most urgent civil rights fight of our life. It's the most urgent civil rights fight of our lifetime. So as I said a few minutes ago, I mean, my call to action is, as you talk about voting rights that's happening, voter suppression happening across the country, also ensure that you're talking about voter suppression happening right here in the nation's capital, and you're taking action on that. You can visit our website at 51for51.org, or you can visit our one of our websites called whywecantwait.com. And that website gives you a direct tool to just type your name and address and send a letter to a senator or a text or email or a call. And you don't have to type anything. I'm lazy as well. I don't like typing, so it types it for you. So I'll drop those links in the chat. But just remember, as you're talking about voting rights, always talk about talk about statehood.
Thank you, Jamal. April.
That's so important, right? Connect those two dots. I do want to just go back and say that, we felt it was important for our move, our freedom ride, to make sure that we lifted that up in each state, because we want this to become a national outcry that DC have statehood. But I want to take a different approach, if I may. There's, power can come as explosive as dynamite, right? Dynamite can break concrete. But so can a drip of water over time. It can still break concrete. And I just wanted to give that perspective before I say what actions to take, because it doesn't matter where we are, whether you are being a part of something explosive, right? Like attending rallies or protests in your community, or whether you're doing those kinds of things that drip, that move like the water that drips over time and breaks that concrete, right? It doesn't matter which way, both can create the same impact. And so what I would suggest is the continuing to have these conversations. Part of the battle, as we see right now, is the narrative, right? The narrative of what's happening in social media, in conversations. It's so impactful now that we find ourselves at a very volatile moment. And so having conversations where you're talking about race, right? Where you're talking about the history of this country at a time when people are trying to undermine and not discuss the history of what happened in this country, right? Just having a conversation about race in your community is valuable right now, because we need to make sure that we don't usher ourselves into an era where we forget, because for those who, people who forget are doomed to go back and repeat those ugly things. And so something as drip, drip, drip like conversations is vital to have. Yes, go to protests that may occur in your community where people are standing in front of Congress saying, please, pass the DC Statehood Act, pass the Freedom to Vote Act. So if you can come to those things, that is so important. Do those things now, but also go to your local board meetings. If you have one day out of the month, choose a meeting, whether it's education, whether it is the county commission or city council. Those representatives need you right now. Because right now, those meetings are being attended by people who have been misinformed by this narrative that I talked about. And so there needs to be some counter narratives in these local meetings so that they won't be willed to do the wrong thing out of fear and intimidation. So support your local representatives by going to these meetings. It is so very, very, very vital right now. But of course, you can also go to our websites. Jamal gave you his that will help you be able to navigate tools on how you can join the fight to get DC statehood. But also, if you go to our information, Black Voters Matter, all you gotta do is Black Voters Matter MTR. Then we also have tools as well that you can utilize to join this effort to get federal legislation.
I dropped y'all a link in the chat too.
Thank you, Jamal. I was about to, but I'll let you take care of it. I think both of you have this has been at least a very dynamic conversation. I think, people who have been supportive of this YW for a long time know that having conversations about racial, social, gender justice is part of what we do here in support of our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women. I think civic engagement is part of racial justice wholeheartedly. So I think I'm so glad that you guys could join us today. Wanted to open up the floor for any, if anyone has a burning question for either April, Jamal, we'd love to hear it. I'll give folks a sec.
Okay, well, I have a question. I'm Carol Burnett, as it says up there, and I had a question earlier. I think everything that has been said is just amazing. But being a child of the 60s, it's like, as you say, the fight continues. And how are we at this point building on the struggles that were done back in the 60s to move this discussion forward in terms of strategies? That's number one. Number two, what really bothers me about what all of these legislators have been doing in Texas and I think in Pennsylvania and in Georgia is the back door. So you get voters into the booth and they make their votes. And then you have people who are going through these votes and then discarding them. And in my mind, that is even more dangerous and precarious. So I just want to just broaden the conversation. And also, Jamal, you too are building on the legacy of many people in DC who have been fighting for statehood, you know, and it's a continual battle. And I would like to see us just make, you know, how do we move forward? So that's my question.
We just need to win the battle, right? But all battles come with soldiers, and every war comes with soldiers. And as we're continuing to build up the movement, we're building up enough soldiers to win this war. Your point about how we're leaning on the tactics and the things we've seen in the 60s, like I mentioned earlier, there are many leaders in this movement who have paved the way for young people like me, and I'm sure a lot of people that April was inspired by to be a part of this movement and just do good work. But the one thing that I do want to point out is it's not just about like how do we rethink through redo the strategies that they did in the 60s. Like we've been fighting, right? Like we've been fighting. But right, as April mentioned, that analogy, it's not just no more about taking the streets. It's how do we really empower and educate people? Because I think that, and that's at least a part of the movement that I'm leading with statehood, is how do we empower and educate people? Because a lot of people just don't understand the purpose of the vote. A lot of people don't understand the importance of the vote. A lot of people don't understand the reason why DC should be a state. A lot of people don't even think it's people that live here. So it's how do we continue to educate and reach people and change minds and hearts and beliefs early on, so we aren't continuing with the same generations of things. I think the one thing that our ancestors, I wouldn't say ancestors because it was only 58 years ago, there are people who are still alive that lived through that era. But 58 years ago, the fight was different, but then was different than what it is now. But what we're seeing now is that the fight that they fought for, the government just thought through Republicans just thought through legal ways of suppressing the right to vote. So how do we attack back legally in a way where we're not just talking about electing new people, but really changing the infrastructure of our democracy and the core of our democracy, but also how do we reimagine the structural problems that we're seeing in our democracy that we didn't fix 60 years ago? Because while we did give African Americans the right to vote, we also didn't ensure that that schools were properly funded. We also didn't ensure that African Americans were running for office at a record number. We also didn't ensure that all boats rise with the tide. So there's a lot of more work that has to be done to ensure that we're reaching true equity in our country for Black and brown people. But we have to reimagine that first by ensuring that we have the basic right to vote.
Everything he said. And, I would say also, Dr. King, one of the things he said is that, the arc of the moral, or the moral arc, is long, but it bends towards justice, right? It bends towards justice. And so when we look over historically, Carol, we talk about the gains, we know that when we organize together, we win, right? The same court that years before, the Supreme Court, that said that, in a Plessy decision, in the Dred Scott decision, that said that the white man had no right, that the Black man had no right, that the white man was bound to respect. Many years later, through organized struggle in the streets, the coordinated strategy with the courts created a decision in Brown that undid that, right? And so what we know is, the arc of more is it's long, but it bends towards justice. We also know that in the boycott of Montgomery, what little people know is that that movement was 381 days of sustained action from the people who lived in that community. It didn't happen overnight. She didn't sit and they organized for a month and then they undid that ordinance. It was sustained community action of people walking to work, of carpooling to work, right? To make sure people could transport, but it took time, but they won because they had sustained action. And so we find ourselves in a similar moment where we have to, one, remember that when we organize ourselves, we do win. And it's long, but it's going to bend towards justice. And so what we got to do right now is the very same thing. And so we need a litigation strategy, but we got to have a legislative strategy, but we got to have an organizing strategy. Because without the organizing strategy, none of that happens. Brown versus Board of Education happened because people were doing the freedom rides. Young children were in the city of Birmingham, right? Getting hosed, right? Folks were going in Dallas County day after day, being told by Sheriff Clark to turn around. All of those movements created the decisions of the accommodation law to the Supreme Court. So I'll be brief and just say that what we've got to do is, one, as a people, have that collective memory that you got, Carol, that we had some sustained organizing moments that created victories. And so today, when we go out and we have to have the same type of strategy, and we have to continue to be engaged in our community outside of voting. Because see, voting is the entry point. That's it. It's the beginning. It is not the end. And so we have to remember that after we vote, we've got to continue to activate. We've got to continue to go to these meetings, and we've got to continue to imagine, what do we want? We know what we want to fight against, right? But what do we want? What is it that we're fighting for in our community? So we have to begin to think about those things and stay. You don't need an election to go door to door, right? We don't need a candidate to knock on someone's door and stay connected to them about what's happening in our communities. And so we just got to reimagine what civic engagement looks like. We've got to increase the purpose of civic engagement. And if we do those things and we remember our history, that when we fight together, when we work together in a sustained manner, we win. And that is why I believe that right now, even though things are they look discouraging, I can only imagine they look discouraging to those slaves, right? I can only imagine that it looked discouraging to those brothers and sisters who were coming to the South to try to get the accommodations to be just treated fairly, but they won. And so our leg of the race, we're gonna win it. And I wanna make sure that I have that message tonight. We are going to win our leg of the race. And our leg of the race is to not just deal with accessibility, right? Our leg of the race is really to answer that final question of, how do we build and rebuild a nation? Because be clear, the Constitution has, the Declaration of Independence has many special moments in it. But the moment that I think is most instructive to us in this season is when it says that, right? That when this country ceases to give the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to abolish it and create something new. And so in this moment, what is our newness? And it is our part of the leg to create that newness of what this country should really look like and be like for us all. So we're gonna win, Carol.
Didn't I tell y'all it's an honor to be on a panel with April? Bring all of the fire. But I want to put one more thing into perspective real quick. And I do have to hop because I have to go back to this memorial. Our country is the most diverse that it has ever been in the history of our country. But in opposing, it's also the most divided we have ever been. And a part of that, we're the most divided, but also we're the most diverse, but also the most divided. And I put that into perspective because this is truly about racism and rooted into what race you are and where you come from. And to put that even more into perspective, one thing that we're failing to do as a country, in addition to all the things that April said, is having the conversation. Is that we are afraid to have the conversation. We're afraid to have the unspoken truth. Is that we say that if you're a Democrat, I don't want to hear from you, and you only believe in the AOC values, you only believe in Joe Biden, you believe all these things, and it's the same thing on the opposite. If you're a Republican, you think this, you think that, and we aren't having a conversation together on how to move forward. And part of that is it plays a huge role because for far too long we've been left out of the conversation. So how we move forward is it has to be together. It has to be better together, but it also has to be equitable. It has to ensure that everyone in the conversation has an opportunity to participate fairly in their democracy, to have a vote, to ensure that the schools that they send their kids to in their backyards are well funded and resourced with food and education and everything else and teachers. But we have to have the conversation, and if we don't have more of these conversations like this, whether if it's 2 people or 20 or 300 people in this room, I don't care. As long as we're having a conversation, that's what's important. So I think we have to continue having the conversation, that even whether if it's divisive or it's not.
All powerful words. I think I take away, I wrote a little note to myself that's like sustained outrage, but also advocacy. So I think I'm gonna put that on my sign behind my head. I just want to, we like to keep these around an hour. So going to wrap up here. Just wanted to say a quick thank you to April and Jamal for joining us today. Our mission at the YWCA is to eliminate racism and empower women. And we love to have these conversations, and we'll continue them into 2022. But also that takes dollars to keep the lights on. So as always, if you're feeling a giving mood, you can visit our website at ybcanca.org to make a donation. We appreciate you, and thank you so much. Hope to see you in person soon. Bye, folks.
Thank you all.